Hello and welcome to the Queermonga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robear, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Queermonga Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness through the direct experience provided by the ancient practice of ecstatic trance postures. And it was the insightful work of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman, who found the clues and revived this practice. As an educational institution, we recognize to thrive, we must take an open approach. So we're inviting scholars of parallel research in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. And on these continuing Sunday discussions, we've included a full spectrum of topics, like neuroscience, mysticism, trance states, anthropology, art history, archaeology, archaeoastronomy, shamanism, wisdom traditions, sacred landscape, sound, dance, mythology, many, many more. And you're welcome to visit our website at queermongainstitute.com. There's a full selection of recorded presentations available. And you might also try trancepostures.com. It's easier to remember. There's been many studies and books written about the workings of the mind. Most of these studies, of course, are focused on the physical workings of the brain, which is a fascinating topic unto itself. But what about that subtle energy alongside the physical, the medium through which consciousness acts on the realm of matter and energy? Can science offers theories that fully contain and explain our own experiences and questions that arise? First, what's consciousness? Is there life and consciousness after death? How does the mind affect our experiences and the physical world reflect my expectations? Are these seeming coincidences in our life random? Or do they serve some kind of a purpose? And where do the spirits and matter meet? So today, let's push the envelope to the outer edges of consciousness research. This is an exciting topic. It's right up our alley and our mission as an institute. So I'm going to allow Laura to
say a few words.
Say a few words.
Well, I wonder when we're going to live in a world and a worldview that contains all of our experiences, including the most delightful, the most meaningful, the mystical experiences that we have. On a weekly basis in our work, and I know that we're not alone in this, we seem to tilt space and time as we travel in our ecstatic trance posture work across that threshold into a magical realm. And not just a mythic realm, as Joseph Campbell would have you say, but literally we are there. And quantum physics might explain the Einstein spooky effect at a distance that we experience, the coincidence where we have people scattered across the globe and we're all sharing similar experiences, where we wake up the ancestors of the culture whose artifact we're using, and they have something profound to say to us, where the spirits, however you want to define them, engage us to say this is a much more magical and intelligent and living universe than we are saying in our sciences. So it's with great pleasure that we introduce a scientist today, that we chat with her for a couple of hours, who has been pushing the seams of that envelope with a consortium of many scientists, who has been at work with for many decades at putting this back into the equation.
Maybe we should let Brian have the honor of doing the introduction.
Brian, yes, Brian Tucker.
Well, I just wanted to say, Brenda, I'm grateful that you could join us today with the Queermonga Institute and be a part of this conversation that Paul and Laura are hosting. I know you from the context of the work that you do locally here in the central New Jersey area, and the many meetups that you've been able to host with the International Consciousness Research Lab. Because of COVID, people have been able to also participate globally in these meetups, but there was a time where we were able to meet in person, and it's always a delight to hear you speak. I was going to mention my first encounter was through a mutual friend of ours, Jennifer Morgan, who runs the Deep Time Network, which is a forum for exploring deep time and the cosmos. And I remember, Brenda, when you came to speak to one of the classes that Jennifer led, you kind of filled our minds with a possible explanation of our interaction with the material world that many of us hadn't really heard before. Not only were we expanded by the vastness of 13.8 billion years of the cosmos, but you kind of brought us into an understanding of the quantum realm and some of the subtle work, some of the subtle influence that consciousness has on the material world. So I was always very grateful for any chance that I had when I can hear you speak and learn about the work that you and Robert Jahn conducted at Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. So what I wanted to say is that I know that you hold a master's degree in developmental psychology from the University of Chicago, and you have a deep interest in the humanities and history, the philosophy of religion, and cross-disciplinary approaches to consciousness. And the culmination of this work, which has spanned over 30 years with ICRL, with the PEAR lab and ICRL. So I just want to say it's a deep honor to have you here with us today. And I so much appreciation that you're such a local resource for many of us searching in this domain, and internationally for many, many scientists and others who are researching. So welcome, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Brian. And well, all of you in the Institute for inviting me. I am very pleased to be with you today and to share whatever experience I have had in the search for the meaning of consciousness. I can't say I've got any real answers, but I've clarified the questions a bit over the years.
I think the questions are important. Yeah, we must ask them. We must say, why can't our worldview fit our experiences? How did you begin your quest, Brenda?
Oh God, it's really been a lifelong quest in many ways. Starting out when I was just a kid, and I was fascinated by fairy tales and the whole world of magic. And then I graduated from the fairy tales to the study of the history of different religions. From that, I went on to just looking for the nature of consciousness, which seemed to be very basic to everything. When I was in graduate school, or actually when I was an undergraduate, which I did a little later than most people because I had left school early to get married and have kids. So when I returned to just get my college degree, I couldn't decide what to major in. So I ended up with two majors. One of them was in the humanities and the other one was in psychology. It turns out that each of those majors required an independent project. And by chance, whatever that is, I ended up doing my humanities project in studying consciousness and altered states of consciousness. And in my psychology major, I did one of the earliest replications of the remote viewing work that was recently at that time being conducted at SRI. That turned out to be very interesting, and I ended up having some very striking results in that little project. So I applied to graduate school in humanities and in psychology. Psychology accepted me. So I ended up doing my master's degree in the developmental psychology. Interestingly, when I went to complete that degree, I ran into some problems with the faculty who were not very fascinated by my interest in these areas. Well, make a long story short, they wanted me to try replicate the findings that I had done on my own under their conditions, which I agreed to do. And we ended up, to their amazement and discomfort, getting some very good results. But they still were uncomfortable, and they said, look, why don't you just take a master's degree and settle for that? And I said, fine, it's okay with me. as it turned out, I had then recently met Robert Jahn, Bob Jahn, and we had been discussing the possibility of me moving to Princeton to work with him. So we did their replication, and we got some very good results there. They accepted my master's thesis, which was a critical review of the remote viewing work. And since I was doing critical, they were happy with that. But my criticism was of the judging method rather than of the phenomenon itself. And they finally gave in and allowed me to get a master's degree in remote viewing, which I think was not what they had in mind. In any event, back in 1975, I had attended a meeting of the Parapsychological Association, where I gave a talk about the work that I had done in remote viewing and the results that we had. By that time, I had probably carried out about 35 trials, looking at different dimensions of variables, looking at time and space and the distance and so forth. And in any event, there I was at this Parapsychological Association meeting, and to give a talk about some of the remote viewing work that I did. But during one of the breaks in the program, I was introduced to Bob Jahn, and it was a fascinating meeting because I had approached him and said, I understand that you've been looking for me. And he replied, you might say that. That was the beginning of something wonderful. He mentioned that he was planning to set up a program in Princeton to study anomalous phenomena. And would I be interested in working with him? And I said, you bet. And again, synchronicity hit. I had recently been divorced. I had recently sold my house. And I was at the moment trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. Anyway, make a long story short, Bob finally was able to get approval from his very reluctant university administration to establish the program. He was able to obtain funding from the program from Mr. James McDonnell, who was the chairman or president of the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company. He was also a Princeton graduate. And Bob knew him through his mainstream research area, which was in aerospace engineering. He was the person who had developed the whole concept of electric propulsion, which is used for deep space travel, such as the missions to Mars and such.
Oh, wow.
So I said, yeah, I'm ready. Then they were worried about why do you want to hire a psychologist to head an engineering program? And that became a little bit touchy. They finally agreed to allow me to have the job with the rank of a research assistant, which, as many of you may know, is the rank that one gives to graduate students. So that was fine with me. In any event, in June of 1979, I moved to Princeton, and Bob and I set up the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, or PEAR, laboratory. That also has a bit of a coincidence associated with it, so I'm going to jump forward and then I'll come back. After we had been established in a little room in the basement of the engineering school that had no room number or sign, we felt we needed to put some kind of a sign on the door. We thought we were being very clever, and we put a Greek psi on the door, since it was had many different implications. It stood for psychology, it stood for wave function, and of course it stood for psychic phenomena.
I'm sure it could be misinterpreted by some. Go ahead.
Well, it certainly was, because we had several people ask us why we had a devil's pitchfork on our door.
Oh,
Which was, I think, a good indication of where the resistance was coming from. As a psychologist, that wasn't too abstract. In any event, Bob and I went off to lunch and one day, and we were saying that, we really had to get a name for the lab, and Bob suggested the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. And I said, I don't know, that doesn't really grab me. Let's think about it a little more. Well, our lunch came and Bob said, pass the salt. And I picked up the salt shaker and discovered that I was holding a pewter pear in my hand. And I looked at it and I said, no, let's give this a little more thought. We finished our main course and the waitress came back and said, can I interest you folks in dessert? We have some fresh pear cake. Now, that was the only time in my entire life I had ever encountered pear cake. And at that point, I said to Bob, look, I can't fight this, because if I say no, I'm going to get hit in the head with a pear when we leave. And that's so pear it is. Fortunately, a pear on the door didn't seem to bother too many people, or they couldn't think of a way that it did. So let's get back to the purpose.
Well, let me ask you a question about anomalies. So the Princeton Anomalies, engineering anomalies. Anomalies are very important. I think we love anomalies here because they serve as red flags to say, hey, look at me over here. Worldview needs expansion. If you have these anomalies consistently approaching, if they're really not anomalies, they're a phenomenon. It's just that our worldview hasn't quite accepted them. So they stand right outside the boundary line. So why did you choose the term anomalies?
For just the reason that you said. Anomalies are phenomena that occur that we don't have any ordinary explanation for. And that was really what the PEAR lab was studying. We had two areas of research. One of them was looking at human-machine interactions. This was prompted by an undergraduate project that Bob supervised. Again, originally somewhat reluctantly. This student had wanted to do a replication of work that had been reported by physicist Helmut Schmidt, who at the time was working for the Boeing aircraft. And Schmidt had developed this random number generator or random event generator and did some tests seeing if people could affect it with their minds, just by their intention. And the student was able to obtain some very interesting results, which got Bob thinking about, boy, that there are important pragmatic implications for this in the world of engineering, which was, of course, what Mr. McDonnell was interested in. In the aerospace business, it had not been uncommon for pilots to report strange malfunctions in the cockpits, especially when under emotional stress or intense experiences.
So he might see that we'll be operating spaceships with the mind in the future. This
it
man
may
was
well
had a
be.
vision.
Isn't that the way they did it in the book Dune?
Exactly. Yeah.
So anyway, the main part of the program really was the study of the interaction of human operators with various random physical systems and processes to see if human intention could affect the way these processes came out. They were all, of course, statistical processes, being random. And the idea of most of these experiments was to ask people to try to shift the mean of the output distributions of these devices in accordance with a pre-stated intention to move it to a higher number or to a lower number, or in some cases to the right or to the left. And we did carry out a huge number of experiments in that area, many hundreds of thousands, probably
Of
millions.
trials of the same experiment trials. Okay.
And I'll come back to that in a moment and explain more about that. But let me just mention the second part of the program was to continue the exploration of the remote viewing, or remote perception, as we called it, and to see if we could develop a more quantitative, analytical approach to determining how much information had been achieved in these processes. So we weren't trying to prove whether the phenomena existed. We just wanted to be able to measure how much information they were able to produce.
To quantify.
Right. So those were the two experimental or empirical parts of our program. Excuse me. The going back to the human machine experiments, for those of you, let me explain how these things work. There were different kinds of devices: microelectronic, macroscopic, mechanical, hydrodynamic, etc., that were all based on some kind of random process. Now, a random process is something, an event that is not predictable. There's a degree of uncertainty, like when you flip a coin. You should get a head or a tail 50% of the time, okay? Now, if you flip the coin 10 times and you got 6 heads, you wouldn't be terribly impressed by that. But if you flipped it 100 times and you got 60 heads, that was a little less probable. And if you flipped it 1,000 times and got 600 heads, now you knew that something odd was going on. And if your coin was not biased, there was something else happening. And of course, we made sure that our devices had no bias. They were carefully calibrated, and left to their own devices, they produced purely random results. So we asked our operators, and I have to mention that we called the people who participated in our experiments operators. They were not subjects.
Mhm.
The subject of the experiment was the performance of the devices. And I can also share with you a little side anecdote. When we first set up the program, we were asked to get the approval of the Human Subjects Committee on our protocols. Well, they reviewed our protocols. They came back and said, well, we don't see anything wrong with the protocols. They seem to be well controlled, but we have to alert you to the fact that you must take steps to be sure that your subjects do not suffer from metaphysical capabilities as a result of these experiments.
Yeah.
I thought that was rather amusing. It turned out to have an advantage, because when we had operators come to the lab to do experiments, we would make it a point to inform them that now, no matter what happens as a result of these experiments, we don't want you to leave thinking you're God, unless, of course, you thought you were God when you came in, and we don't want to disabuse you of that view. And just as your response, people would laugh. And that was wonderful, because as soon as they laughed, they were more relaxed. And that I think was important, because we wanted the people who participated to have a good time. We told them to approach these experiments as like games, and just to do sets of 3 efforts in any of the experiments. We called it a tripolar protocol, where they would first try to shift the distribution, the output distribution, to one side, and then try to shift it to the other side, and do a third run where they weren't trying to do anything. And this applied across the board. And of course, all of their intentions were recorded ahead of time. The output was recorded automatically on a strip chart and in a computer file. You know, all of the precautions were taken that there would be no chance of any bias creeping in, either from the protocol or even from the environment, in case the devices was sensitive to temperature or humidity or whatever.
Just the
Okay.
operator, yeah, could produce that bias. Okay.
So anyway, over the 28 years that the program ran, we conducted many, as I said, tens of thousands of experiments. And a single trial in the microelectronic random event generator, which was the one we had the largest database on, and was akin to flipping, each trial was akin to flipping 200 coins, okay? And by chance, you'd expect a count of 100. But of course, you might get 105, you might get a 92, you might get a 98, you might get 103, whatever. So these trials were conducted in runs, and a typical run might be either 100 or 1,000 trials, okay? And they were generated very rapidly at, just, well, I guess I think it was about 1 second per trial, something like that. And it might be generated automatically with one button push, and then a sequence of trials would be generated. And there would be a feedback display on the front of the REG, the random event generator, and a graph on the computer screen that would be going either up or down as the trial outcomes accumulated. So as I said, the database was huge. The effects that we were seeing were small. As I said, if you flip the coin 10 times and get 6 heads, you're not going to be terribly impressed. But we were doing very large trials, and we were seeing correlations between the output means and the operator's intentions. The effects were very tiny, maybe a couple of parts per thousand. But we encouraged people to generate large databases to come back and do more and more. And as long as they were having fun, they were willing to do that. And these very small effects did compound over large databases to a statistically significant or unlikely outcome that was beyond what you'd get by chance. Now, I hope that's clear. I was kind of running on there, but I wanted to you to understand.
I do have a question. You mentioned pilots in planes who, when they were in a high emotional state, would have instrument malfunctions or instrument anomalies. So there was that emotional component there. But
Yes.
how do you replicate that? Because it seems to me, and widely observed among psychic phenomenon, that an emotional state amps up the whole phenomenon, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So how is that at all a factor or not in these experiments when you had the operators sit in front of machines, and what were they actually doing to try to tilt the results?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think producing or creating an environment that was fun, getting people to laugh and be relaxed and play was also fun. And it turned out that although we were actually, our primary variable was intention, almost all of our operators would say something to the effect that, it's more than just having an intention. I have to feel a connection to the machine. I have to feel a resonance, as if the device is somehow an extension of myself, like a pilot might have with his plane, or like most of us have with our computers or our phones, or a musician might have with his or her instrument. There's some kind of a connection that goes beyond just an I-it interaction to an I-thou interaction, if you will. And that seemed to be very important. In fact, we wondered how one could set up an experiment whereby one could measure that emotional component. Because it's one thing to say, okay, now I want to go high or I want to go low. But it's another thing to say, I want to resonate with the machine or I don't. She loves me not, sort of thing. So we developed an experimental deviation or variation called field reg. This involved developing small random event generators, portable ones that you could attach to a small palm top computer and take out into the field. And that being a double entendre, we were also looking to see if there was some kind of field effect that was generated when you were in a group of people who were all, if you like, on the same wavelength, especially during having a strong emotional experience. This might be a meditation group, it might be a concert, it might be a religious service, it might even be a party. But these devices were just out there going click, 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 unknown to the participants in the group, and just generating these strings of random bits.
Oh, interesting.
And we discovered that when we took these to resonant environments, like I just mentioned, we were getting deviations from the chance output during these times when people really felt that they were of one mind. When we took them to lectures or board meetings, mundane environments, nothing happened. The devices were producing the kind of random chance that you would expect. We did many hundreds of these field reg experiments, and we did find these correlations quite regularly. In fact, those experiments were really the basis for the program that Roger Nelson, who was a member of our staff, subsequently established, called the Global Consciousness Network, where he had random event generators at various locations around the world. I think on the average, you would have about 70 or 75 of these devices. And they were all feeding their ongoing input or output, into a common server repeatedly. And he found that in situations of strong worldwide resonance, one of the strongest effects that he saw was during the 9/11 attacks, where the output of all these devices were all going into sync and deviating from their chance expectation. He also did it during a lot of other such situations. My favorite one was the moment of Bob John's death, which was about 3 years ago, I guess, which happened to occur at 2:00 in the morning. And yet when Roger looked at the data that was associated with that time from around the world, he had an effect that was almost as large as the 9/11 effect.
Oh my.
There was something was happening, and we didn't know what it was. Roger has postulated that there's some kind of a consciousness field that when people are all in resonance with each other, that field picks up on that, and the random event generators can somehow sense that field and become part of it
And reflect
and demonstrate these deviations.
It reminds me, because you sit in a baseball stadium and everybody does the wave, and the whole crowd is at one, or everybody's cheering at a certain play. And it reminds me of the Mayan ball fields and how you can see how huge they were, and you can imagine all those people there for this display and play of the divine, who's going to favor the divine. I mean, they had life and death situation going on there. It was all a play of who do the gods favor, which is a lot of chance and gambling and all that. It has a basis for that. But you can imagine that it had a cosmic purpose. And so maybe our ancients, well, they obviously knew a lot. They were embracing these concepts early on, I think, and finding this.
Well, it turns out that Bob was a fanatical baseball fan. So he actually tried taking these field rig devices to baseball games. He did not get much in the way of effects, but we figured that because half of the people there were on one wavelength and half of them were on another, they were canceling each other out.
Yeah.
There is a friend of ours, colleague Rick Leskowitz, who lives up in Boston, and who took a random event generator to a Boston, I think it was the World Series game, where just about everybody in the stands was rooting for the Boston team, who happened to win. And he got some interesting results, positive results on his device. He has a device on it. I think you can find a video of his experiments. It's called The Joy of Socks. And, I think there's a small video that describes that experiment and the results. It was, but, of course it didn't always work. This is not something, it's still a random process, and it's still a process that one expects to work half the time, but it was working more than half the time in all of these experiments. And with these millions of trials that we had produced over the years, the deviation from chance compounded to effects that were well beyond any statistical expectation.
How did you choose your operators? Were they people that maybe had some psychic ability coming in versus those who say they didn't? I mean, that must have been a factor in some of your selection, I would imagine.
We were not permitted to study the people, remember. We didn't want them to think they had divine capabilities, although we were very happy if they did. We would talk about such things, but they were not part of the experiments. All of the people who participated in our experiments were volunteers. None of them claimed to have unusual abilities. They had an interest in the topic, or they thought it might be fun to try. They were not paid. The only motivation that we could offer were, besides having a good time, we always had an assortment of cookies and juice and coffee and whatnot available. And we did everything we could to make them feel that they were at a friend's house. Our lab was decorated very much like a comfortable living room.
Mhm.
The walls were paneled. There was a big orange sectional couch that was facing this huge pinball machine on one wall of the lab. It was a random mechanical cascade, a device that, let's see, it was, I think, 10 feet high and 8 feet wide. And it dropped 9,000 little marbles down through a maze of 300 and some odd pegs into this array of collecting bins.
Scientific pinball machine. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because of the nature of the random bounces that occurred, you ended up with a distribution that looked very Gaussian, very
Like
much like
bell
a
curve.
standard bell curve,
Mhm.
except that you'd get a few more balls to the right or a few more balls to the left when you were trying to do that. And again, the distribution means were being shifted ever so slightly.
Weren't you ever tempted, though, to bring in somebody with some known or a verified psychic abilities after hours? Maybe it didn't count, but weren't you curious to see what their effect would be? I mean,
Frankly, no.
really?
The few that we met were driven by ego. They wanted to prove something. They wanted to be paid. They wanted to be published. We didn't want anything to do with that. We wanted what ordinary people could do.
Right.
Like my interaction with my computer. There are days when it makes it very clear it doesn't like me.
Yeah, I have that problem too. Yeah, but so I would also say
Anyway, the
that
answer to your question is we did not test superstars. We actually did have people bring a few of them by. Oh God, they were really a pain in the who's-its.
That's
But it
interesting.
does demonstrate, and that is our observation, that these abilities are widespread. They're
Yes,
common. They're much more common than we give credit for. We're taught by
absolutely.
our society to dismiss these coincidences, these anomalies when they happen. We're taught to discount them. And so it's not there in the vernacular, it's not there in the equation, but they're there.
Mm.
So I'm not surprised by your results.
And none of them produced results that were any stronger than our ordinary operators, but they were much easier to work with. But
Interesting.
let me just step back a bit. You know, although our original intention was to be studying human machine interactions from an engineering standpoint, we learned pretty early on from the results that we were seeing that we were looking at something that was far more profound than engineering operations. We were looking at the effects of consciousness on the physical world, particularly on any random process that we could think of in the physical world that we could create, you know, in a laboratory
What
experiment.
happened there is happening everywhere. Yeah.
But, you know, we have, pardon me, we have randomness everywhere. In fact, when you look at the natural world and you even look at the human world, it's very hard to escape randomness, whether you're looking at the stock market, whether you're looking at political polls, whether you're looking at the weather, or even at the level of recombinant DNA. There are random processes going on everywhere. I like that because in the world that we're living in today, I have to keep remembering that we learned that it just took a few extra bits per thousand to skew the mean of a distribution in the direction that you wanted, if you were emotionally connected to that process.
The trick, yeah, yep, okay.
You know, we do not have to convince everyone in the world to have the same intention, but we do have to get a critical mass of people working together in, again, on the same wavelength with a shared intention and a strong emotion. And it can change the outcome of different kinds of events in the environment. There was a study done some years ago by the Maharishi University where they had a group of meditators. I can't remember the details. You'll have to forgive me for this. But what they were able to show that was when these meditators were all in sync, the crime rate went down in the community. It works. We used to have a little poster on the wall of our laboratory that said, if we all work together, we can totally disrupt the system.
I like that.
So science continues to insist on this objective stance, separating object and subject, when another branch of science, quantum physics, tells us, no, the scientist is always part of that experiment.
Absolutely.
So tell us a bit about that.
Well, all of the patriarchs of quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr, Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Erwin Schrödinger, and others, recognized that what was going on here involved consciousness, that indeed consciousness was primary. A dear friend of mine who passed away, 15 years ago, told me a story. She had been a countess in Hungary, and she had been involved with organizing these meetings and whatnot of all these honchos. And she found herself at a banquet sitting next to Max Planck, who she described as an absolutely charming gentleman. And at one point she turned to him and said, well, Dr. Planck, now that you have resolved the question of the quantum, what is the next frontier in physics? And he, according to her, he replied, my dear lady, clearly the next frontier is the study of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we published a book that we called Quirks of the Quantum Mind. At one point, Bob and I started, let me go back a little bit. As a psychologist and humanist, I frankly never taken a physics course. Okay. I was totally blank on it. But at one point, very early on in our relationship, Bob Jahn asked me, what do you think is going on in these processes? And I proceeded in my long-winded fashion to tell him what I thought was happening. And he nodded and he said, that's very interesting. Do you know about covalent bonds? And I said, no, what's a covalent bond? Do you know about covalent bonds? Well, I didn't.
Yes, I do. They're the parts that keep the atoms together. They're the interrelation in the interior of an atom.
Exactly. When two atoms come together, they form a molecule. And it turns out that the energy of the molecule is greater than the combined energy of the two, constituent atoms.
Parts. Yeah.
Physicists can't quite explain this. They have a fudge factor they call the exchange force. But it's a very interesting phenomenon. And when Bob explained this to me, I remember saying, oh my, you guys have the answer, but you just don't know what the question is. I know what the question is.
Yeah.
So anyway, Bob was teaching a graduate level course that year in quantum mechanics, and he suggested that I sit in on it. And I said, oh, come on, I can't deal with all the math and the equations. He says, don't worry about the equations. Just listen to the principles, the process. I said, okay. So I sat in on this course and I started learning a little bit about it, the various principles of quantum mechanics. My favorite one, by the way, is uncertainty. I think the whole world runs on uncertainty. Which is, of course, the basis of randomness. But anyway, at one point, one of the students in the class said to me, aren't you a psychologist? And I said, yes. He said, why are you taking a course in quantum mechanics? I said, quantum mechanics? I thought this was the psychology of subatomic particles. Well, it turns out it actually is. And Bob and I spent a couple of years playing with the concepts of quantum mechanics, coming to recognize that virtually all of these scientific principles were extrapolations of subjective experiences. Okay, for example, mass. We know what mass is. Boy, that's heavy. Or, gee, he's a lightweight. We know what distance is, right? Boy, that's
far out.
Yeah. Or boy, that's close to my heart. We talk about energy. Oh God, I'm so excited, or I'm so turned on, or I'm so turned off. But all of these ideas are really developed from these very subjective experiences that we all have as humans.
Right.
And we are now projecting those experiences onto the physical world. Anyway, the short form of the book is quantum mechanics is not a description of the universe. Quantum mechanics, or indeed any model, any physical model, is a description of how consciousness organizes its experiences of the physical world. And when you look at it that way, it becomes really quite fascinating. And as I said, that's where concepts like uncertainty or complementarity in particular become very relevant to the study of consciousness. We live in a dualistic paradigm, okay? There's left and right, there's high and low, there's good and evil, there's male and female, you name it. We learn that from the time we're little kids. But when you start thinking in terms of complementarity, you're no longer talking about situations of either or. You're talking of both and. And you
Right.
come to recognize that each of these perspectives is just one way of looking at the same thing. So, the wave particle duality. Sometimes an event acts like a wave, sometimes it acts like a particle. How it acts has a lot to do with what you're looking for. When you set up your experiment to study a particle, you're looking at variables like distance and time and momentum and that sort of thing. But when you're looking for a wave phenomenon, you're going to start looking for frequencies and amplitudes. It's the same event, but you're looking at it through a different lens or a different filter. Bob and I used to refer to each other as he was a particle and I was a wave. Bob was always very good at time and space, and I do frequencies and amplitudes. When we would travel together, if I was driving and he was navigating, we did fine. We never ran into heavy traffic. We never got lost. When we switched seats and I was reading the map and he was driving, we'd always run into traffic and we'd end up taking a wrong turn somewhere. We were in the same car, but again, this is the perspective and how that perspective affects the experience that you have. This is important, and I think this bears on the work that you folks are doing. I don't know much about it, but again, it's I think, I can't remember, I think it was a Native American patriarch who once described the phenomena in terms of saying there's an attitude you can take. The attitude, whether it is a physical attitude, or it's a mental attitude, will influence the experience that we have. And I think in your work at your institute, you've demonstrated this in one dimension. And I think in our work, we've demonstrated it in another one, in an objective, perhaps quantitative way, and you have demonstrated it in a subjective, qualitative way.
And I think that ancient wisdom also embraced this idea. It's not a new idea. This is, you could say this in mythic terms and other terms, ancient wisdom was onto this. You could say that this is an interactive universe and we experience it, you experience it. But I love the idea of a psychology of the particles, a psychology that we have a personal relationship with the universe. And the other thing that really bothers me is when you invoke quantum principles to explain these subtle energy, these subtle mind, these outlier experiences that are so common that we have. Oh no, that's quantum physics. We're in a Newtonian physics universe. No, that's the tiny little part. We're made of particles. My molecules are right there. My subatomic molecules. This is me. I'm inhabiting this. So yeah, it can work. Could you explain that one so that I will have a better defense? Brenda Dunne says, I have it straight from the scientists. And
the physical models, whether quantum or Newtonian, are simply extrapolations of subjective experience. They are coming from consciousness. All science is by definition an activity of consciousness. What the scientist finds has a lot to do with what he or she is looking for. It has a lot to do with how they pose the question. It has a lot to do with how they decide to analyze the results.
And what they expect.
And what they expect. Now, I would never say that quantum mechanics can explain consciousness. What I would say is that consciousness can explain quantum mechanics.
And everything else.
And everything else. And, again, it's not just my consciousness or yours. It is consciousness with a big C. Consciousness. There is one consciousness. I like to think of it as the organizing principle of the universe. I love the Eastern idea of the Tao, where you have this dance of yin and yang. these complements, not opposites, complements that are constantly interacting. You know, the I Ching is the book of changes. It is how these dimensions vary over time and with experience and as a result of observation.
The dance of the universe.
And this is what is going on. You have consciousness as the organizing principle, and then you have the world, the physical world, as a vast random process. This is what, you know, the folks who study 0-point energy talk about. Basically, the universe consists of all of these subatomic interactions that are purely random. Now let's think in terms of the metaphor of remote viewing. Okay, the consciousness establishes a framework, a frame of reference. Okay, we ask a question: where will so and so be at such and such a time on Thursday? Okay, we've now created what a physicist might call a potential well. That is a framework for an event. And then it can let go and just allow itself to go out there into the cosmos with this intention of finding information that relates to where so-and-so is at such and such a time on such and such a date.
Mhm.
And something comes through. You're not really, it is not a rational process at all. It is a process of being open to the universe and listening to what it has to tell you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Uh,
And so the other question is this sense of awe and wonder that we have when we contemplate this living universe. Dr. Goodman called it the eternal now, this matrix, this field of consciousness, this emotional connection that we have. So did Newton, starting physics. He was looking for God's handiwork to better understand the creator of it. This separation we have of spirituality and science. I understand the separation of religion and science needed, but spirituality, that sense of connection, that sense of wonder, where is the space for that? Among these scientists that you quote, they all are revering the universe. They have this spiritual sense to them. Where do you see, among all the scientists you know, this meeting point of science and spirituality, or this artificial division between it? Can you speak to
well,
that?
most of the scientists that I've encountered who see that are dead. Well, Bob's dead too, unfortunately. But the scientific paradigm is dualistic. It's deterministic. It doesn't like uncertainty. You know, it wants things to be predictable.
What's answers? Yeah.
You know, I had a conversation with a physicist once who, it was rather an accusing way, said, you know, if what you're doing is right, then everything I've done is wrong. And I said, no, it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. And he said, no, you don't understand. I'd be wrong. Really? Why do you have a devil's pitchfork on your door? Wow. We used to have these 10-year-olds come to the lab from a local school district on a field trip. And we'd show them around, we'd let them try the experiments, and we talk a little bit about basic statistics and experimental scientific method and so forth. And I would say to them, inevitably, how many of you would like to be scientists when you grow up? And there'd always be a bunch of hands that went up, especially since they've just been immersed in it. And I'd say, well, you know, if you want to be a good scientist, you will have to learn how to say two things that are very difficult. The first thing is, I don't know.
Yeah.
The second thing, which is even harder, is I was wrong. If you can't deal with those approaches, you cannot do science, because now you're no longer objective. You are projecting yourself into everything you do. And even if you deny that that's happening, you are wrong.
Well, that's also the basis of emotional intelligence. So there's many good reasons to embrace those.
But there is this fear when you've invested your life into creating a reputation and you've published and you've gotten tenure and all this stuff. You don't want that threatened.
Your house of cards may come tumbling down. Mhm.
Of course it does. You know, I'm a strong believer in uncertainty and randomness everywhere in the universe. What I find really strange is determinism. Determinism is what you want to happen. You know, let's put it this way. Most science is based on statistical analysis, okay?
Mhm.
We do a control experiment, we compare it with our active experiment, we look at the difference and we look to see what the likelihood is by chance, blah, 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 okay? Well, I'll tell you a secret that most scientists will never admit. Well, they may admit it, but it doesn't matter. Statistics are fine as far as they go. They can tell you whether or not something probably happened, okay?
But they can't be
It
certain.
can't tell you what happened. It can't tell you why it happened or even how it happened. Well, I can tell you from many years of experience that something probably happened. And frankly, I'm at a point in my life where I'm rather sick and tired of statistics.
Mhm.
It can only take you so far. You know, Bob and I wrote a paper that we called Science of the Subjective. It was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration quite a while ago. But the thesis was that science cannot proceed any further than it's already gone as long as it insists on objective reality and determinism,
Mhm.
because that's only one half of the picture, okay?
Thank you. And it's in a closed box. Can't get outside of
is.
itself too. You have
All,
to step
all of the
outside.
physical theories only describe what happens in a bounded
Mhm.
environment.
Contained.
There's nothing that happens in a bounded environment, except maybe my microwave, but you know.
Or, this worldview is so insistent on its. Okay, I've got a story to share about Robert Jahn. So, and we did interview him back in the 90s on radio. That was fun. So we're talking with Jerry Pollack, who does the fourth phase of water. He was talking about sitting, because I said, oh, we're having Brenda Dunne. Exciting. And he said, oh, I've got a great Robert Jahn story. Be sure and pass this along. And he said that they're sitting at dinner and Jerry is doing his own anomaly research, his own adventure research, frontier research. And Robert said, well, go, when you look at all the possible projects, go to the farthest out, the wildest idea, because that will have the most impact on society, on the world, on that worldview we're trying to stretch. So wanted to mention, you mentioned the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, of which you're now the head, the ICRL. Would you like to describe what you do there? Then we're going to open it up to phones. And yes, Tony, we will start with you. So
Before I do that, let me just go back to this story.
yeah.
Excuse me. And Bob, Bob was a very respectable, well-established scientist before he got into this business. And I think one of the most wonderful things about him was his commitment to what he regarded was his integrity. Okay. He was not susceptible to what people thought. And when we wrote our first book, Margins of Reality, I remember saying to him, I wonder if anybody's ever going to read this. And he said, it doesn't matter. We wrote it for ourselves, trying to, understand what we've learned. And I remember this conversation. I said, well, if what we've learned is that the unifying force of the universe is love, how are you going to convince people of that, even if you sneak it through under the word resonance, which really is just another word for love, but don't tell anyone I said that. But I said, there have been wonderful, wise people over the aeons who have tried to convince people to love one another. so what has it gained us? Our world is still a mess, and people are still selfish and greedy and self-serving. And Bob said, when the time comes that people can recognize that it's in their own greedy, self-serving benefit to love one another, they will do so.
Mhm.
I'm finding that kind of relevant these days.
Yeah.
Whereas, there's this bifurcation in our society, in our culture, in our world, of people who insist on the determinism, who insist, the separation, this versus that. And then there's this other community, this other distribution of people who go, oh, we can support one another in a time of difficulty. We can help one another. We can love one another.
Mhm.
Okay, a few bits in 10,000 can shift the mean. And I keep telling myself that regularly. Something is happening now that I think is demonstrating in its own way that if we love one another, we can change the world. I never thought at the time we wrote it that many people would read Margins of Reality. We wrote that back in 1986. Okay, that was a long time ago. That book is still selling. It's never made the bestseller list, and it never will. But every month we get reports, we've sold 3 copies, we've sold 8 copies. And I remember our publisher originally said, your book sales are like your data. It's the compilation of a few bits or a few book sales
Over time.
continuously over time. He says most of the time you get a big surge at the beginning and then it falls off and goes out of print.
You
And
could
one
tell it
other,
is slow and steady.
another aside on that, I spoke to somebody a long time ago, before I even got into this business, who was supposed to be a psychic. She said to me, you're going to, and this was while I was still married and being a housewife in suburbia and the whole bit. And she said, I can see a change for your husband. And I'm thinking, well, that's interesting because we had just agreed to get divorced, but nobody knew that except the 2 of us. So I said, well, that's interesting. And what about me? Is there a change for me? And she said, no, not yet. She said, but in a couple of years, you're going to meet an older man who's a teacher, and you're going to write a book. And that book is going to be very important, but probably not until after you're dead.
Wow.
Okay, that's fine. If the book outlives me, that's great. And if people like you are interested in talking to me and having me tell you what I've learned in our studies, that's wonderful, because I've been asked many times to speak or to do interviews. Bob was a fantastic speaker, but Bob was a scientist. Bob never spoke a sentence that wasn't grammatically correct. He was, at first I would try to speak the way he did, and I felt I couldn't. And I said to him one day, I said, Bob, you're the scientist, I'm a storyteller. And I find that when I present this as a story, which usually begins, once upon a time, there was a student who wanted to do an independent project, and I managed to bring in the 3 evil professors who wouldn't supervise her project, and the good dean who helped her, and they all lived happily ever after.
You have lived a fairy tale indeed. Yeah.
And that goes, people hear that and it relates to something deep inside, that fairy tale part of ourselves when we were children. And this is so important when we can tap back into the childish awe and wonder that you mentioned and approach the world that way. Miracles happen.
The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Muriel
Yeah.
Rockhauser, poet. Brian, do you want to go, and then Tony?
Hello,
I'm
Brian.
going to ask people to raise your
Hey,
You
hello,
asked
hello.
me about what I love talking about, so you have to
It's
stop me.
wonderful to hear you talk about what you love doing. I get a sense listening to you and just hearing your stories over the years that shifting of a paradigm is not an easy task. In fact, it will take years and years in the scientific realm to shift some of the dualistic or the materialistic framework. I just want to mention many of us are experiencing around the world phenomena related to the weather that is sort of shaking our sensibilities. Just like last week in this region, we were subject to fierce winds and even a tornado that blew through this region. And I wonder, what is it particularly that you're listening to about the winds of change that are stirred up right now that's really grabbed your attention? Because that tornado got my attention, and I'm concerned more and more about the nature of our consciousness in the world we're living. I'd like to believe that we can shift the mean and begin to have a more favorable way of living on the earth. What are you seeing for us right now?
Good question, Brian.
Well, along with a friend of mine I was talking to yesterday, I would define myself as a watcher. And there's a part of me that is sort of stepping back to just observe all of the processes and events and tendencies in the world around us. I'm seeing, as I said earlier, this bifurcation of people who are drawn together in love, or syntropy, as one of our books describes, or who are separating, looking to separate us versus them. I'm looking at most importantly, trying to tune into the natural forces, earth, air, fire, and water. Okay, those are the only elements that really count. You forget the rest of the ones on the chart. Maybe hydrogen, but that's another story. But nature. We refer to nature as a she, as Mother Nature. Mother Nature, like all manifestations of the feminine goddess, is not only benevolent, loving, and nurturing. She is that, but she is also fierce and destructive. And all of these, she speaks through these elements. We're seeing fires, we're seeing floods, we're seeing landslides and earthquakes and tornadoes. Mother Nature is giving us a message. If you don't change your habits and your way of interacting with me, I'm going to wipe you off the face of the planet. I've done it before and I'll do it again. You're not that important. That creates a certain humility when you recognize that you're only one species on this planet. And Mother Earth, Mother Nature loves and ignores all of them equally.
Yeah.
I'm very big on animals. I'm an animal lover. I live in an area in Princeton where on each side of me, I've got people with these manicured lawns and, lots of grass. I have no grass. I have weeds. I have a pond. I have ground cover. I have bird feeders. I have deer come to my yard to eat my hostas. I
You
have
bees and the
rabbits.
butterflies.
I have butterflies. I have rabbits. I have fish. I have birds of all kinds. I even had a great blue heron come by last year and ate most of my fish, but that's part of the system. But I relate to that. That's much more my reality than the world of the university.
You mentioned the Tao versus Confucius,
Yeah.
nature's order versus human imposed order.
And I think that the only way we're going to change that paradigm is going to be to start with very young children. We're not going to be able to start with graduate students. The professors at our universities are very smart, but they're not very wise, most of them. We need to create an environment of wisdom, of laughter, of fun, of wonder for our children. And I'm delighted to see, my son has 3 daughters, each of whom has grown up with this sense of wonder. They are wonderful girls, women, excuse me. One of them is getting married next month, 2 months.
Congratulations.
Thank you. but they are self contained. They're not kids who want to be part of the crowd. They are unique human beings who are very satisfied with who they are and what they are. And I love that. And we need more of those.
Say also, in response to you, Brian, that science has put so much on the table that works, that's real. It's a matter of shifting the boundaries, expanding it to include that missing half. It's
Exactly.
like not like we want to wipe men off the planet and just put women in place. We want to add women to the equation, right? We want to, it's a and include all of this.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Science integrated with spirituality.
yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, I was going to say science integrated with spirituality, not one or the other, but science integrated.
Right. It's just like two ways of looking at this. In our book, we talked about science is looking for the nature of reality. Spirituality is looking for the reality of nature.
Oh, love that. Gotta write
Okay.
that down. That's good.
Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
It's complementarity all the way.
Well,
And that's what the science of the subjective is about.
Thank you.
we have several questions here. Tony, would you like to go next with your questions?
I'd love to. Brenda, thank you so much. It's been a spectacular presentation.
Thank you.
I like what you said about animals too, because I'm very much that. My world is from the perspective of being an astrophysicist, but I will make a comment that every discovery I've made, everything I've figured out has come to me in dreams. I then have to validate it. And so I want to mention that there is an element in a question I have for you, and then I'll have a comment. And I see that I share the question with Victoria, but I've been experiencing, actually for decades now, a cascade of absolutely amazing, impossible coincidences over and over and over again. And there's something very important that's happening in these. You know, a quick example, a concert I went to in Philadelphia in 1977 was composed looking at the hill I live on now in New Mexico, having never been in New Mexico at that point, or never been west really. You know, just little things come together in ways that the odds, it's not 6 degrees of separation, it's way, way beyond that. And there is a purpose. I think there is a way to look at it. I'm beginning to explore that, and I'm inspired by what you had to say. And I wonder if you would comment any on elements you would put in a research design on the elements of coincidence. And I use the word coincidence rather than synchronicity because I want to do research on it. But and I don't want to necessarily be another person talking about Jung.
There are a couple of authors, they're a married couple in Italy, who wrote one of the books that we published. It's called Syntropy, the Spirit of Love. And the principle they are propounding is that there is a force that is complementary to entropy called syntropy. Entropy moves from the past to the future and breaks things down into smaller and smaller parts and into chaos. Syntropy moves from the future into the past and pulls things together, and it attracts elements that it needs to manifest. I love that book, and I would recommend it. I think it's right on, and I think there is they also have done experiments, and they describe these experiments in their book, and they're relatively straightforward. I'm not going to go into that because they're detailed and so forth, but you can check out the book on our webpage or get it from Amazon. I think, I liked what you said about dreams and animals. I have to share, I had the strangest, most wonderful dream the other night. About 3 nights ago, I dreamt that a firefly had come into my house and it was attracting my attention. It wanted me to notice it. And I started interacting with it, and I created a little home for it with water to drink and leaves to eat and whatnot. And we developed a wonderful, I adopted it. And then the time came when it said, you know, it's time for me to leave because I have to go find a mate. And I said, I can understand that. And I opened the window and it flew off, and I blessed it and wished it good fortune. I had a dream similar to that many years ago, where somehow somebody left a baby bull on my doorstep with a note that said, please take care of my baby. And the same thing, I raised this bull until it was too big to fit in my house. And it told me that it wanted to, I said, we can, you know, you can go out to pasture somewhere and become a stud and all that. No, I want to go to the bull ring. I want to fight. And I went, oh no, you can't do that. You don't understand. That's very dangerous. But he insisted, and we went around in my car to all of the different bull rings for interviews, like you do with a kid who's going off to college. But you know, my dreams and my creativity all seem to stem from this animal side of myself. And I think we need to learn to listen to that. Our animal selves are much closer to nature. They have a wisdom that our rational human selves have tended to lose. But you know, I think it can be done. I think there can be, you know, what can I say? Listen to your dreams and follow them. Your synchronicities, you know, my life has been full of synchronicities. They have always been the things that I have taken as guideposts on my path. And we had another sign in our laboratory. It was a translation from Schiller that went something along the lines of, there is no such thing as chance, but that which we regard as something pure coincidence actually stems from the deepest source of all. I'm not sure I had that exactly right, but I think that's.
I totally know what you're saying, and I totally identify with that. And as I say, I use the word only because it's more convenient to do research with.
Yeah,
So,
of course.
yeah, I will definitely find that. Just a comment though, my field may be a little different. It's astrophysics, and I have to say that to find out something is wrong is the biggest delight in this field. And to be able to say, I don't know, also, it's the beginning of an exploration. And we're looking at all sorts of things which are totally different. I mean, the mass in the universe, circumgalactic matter, dark matter, dark energy, why stars stop forming at half the age of the universe, what's going to happen at twice the age of the universe. We're looking at things and we can begin to ask questions. And that's really fun. But nobody supposes that the answers are right. I mean, they get us closer. And I also have a theory that when you begin to study out something, things come to you that you're on it because you paid attention.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you. I mean, this is great. Just out of curiosity, in Princeton, did you ever encounter Immanuel Velikovsky?
Not at Princeton, but I have encountered his work.
Well, he lived in Princeton.
Did he? I didn't even know that.
Yes.
I thought
Yeah.
he was Russian.
Well, he is, but he lived in Princeton, at least in the latter part of his life.
I did not know that.
Okay, so just a curiosity point.
But now I would wonder whether he ever encountered Albert Einstein.
Well, that might be.
That could have made for some very interesting conversations over lunch.
Well, I'm sure it would. Well, thank you very much. I won't hold you longer, but I'm sure there are questions.
There are writings where Einstein comments on his meetings with Velikovsky.
Oh, are there?
Find that. Yeah, they had conversations. Yeah.
Well,
Speaking of the Russians,
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting
all
that they are?
Yeah, I was just going to say, all of the really great physicists or scientists who discovered new insights were all they all were what can I say, open. They were able to say, I don't know.
Right.
And they all had synchronicities. I don't know if all of them did, but I know that all of the creators of quantum mechanics were very much into Eastern religion and deep philosophy and et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, very few physicists today read their philosophical writings. They only look at the equations, and that's too bad.
Well, actually, I do find physicists that do look at the philosophy, consider that, and are into these worlds. So we're not unique here. There are some, and so there's some hope in that. I guess one thing I would just ask about also, there's such a thing as complexity theory now, and we're looking at phenomena. We mentioned weather earlier, where there are so many things that have causality. It's not like you drop a rock off a pebble and you time it going down. We're dealing with things that have thousands and thousands or millions of dimensions to that. And we look at that from the point of view of large data and things like Bayesian analysis.
Mhm.
So anyway, there are ways that we look at things that do not seem to be deterministic, but we try to get insight there also.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
for that.
Tony.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you very much.
Tony.
Isn't it interesting that the Russians have embraced psychic phenomenon in their experiments, that they have embraced remote viewing? Who knows that the remote viewing experiments that were there at Stanford and where Duke and other places and the government, maybe they've gone underground. Maybe they're just a little quieter because they didn't want Ted
very
Koppel
possible.
outing them. I mean, who knows, right? So isn't it interesting? And why do you suppose that is?
I'll tell you a little story.
Yes.
We had a Russian visitor at our lab for several months, I guess about a year. And one day he came into my office and he closed the door behind him. And he said, Brenda, I have to ask you a question. When you did your remote viewing experiments, why did you do it at 35 minutes precognitive? And I said, well, that's because that was what Targ and Puthoff published, and I was trying to replicate what they did. Although I've since found that the time difference doesn't matter much. Why are you asking? He said, well, in Russia, we did a study of remote viewing, trying to figure out what was the optimal time differential. And we came up with 35 minutes. And I said, isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah.
How interesting. What do you mean the time differential? How were those
From
experiments
the
done?
time that the person described the scene, from the time the other person visited it in the physical world.
Interesting.
All of our remote viewing or remote perception experiments were either precognitive or retrocognitive. Some of the distances were global, 5,000 to 6,000 miles away, and some of them were precognitive up to several days ahead of time or several days after. This is a very important finding. Because what it told us was that in the world of consciousness, time and space are not variables. Time and space are what Einstein said. They're not organizing principles that keep everything from happening at once. There's one other experiment, if I may just throw in another story that I think is relevant to all this. We were wondering what would happen if we had two people doing an experiment together with a shared intention. Would they get a stronger effect? Would there be a combined result? And we carried out a bunch of experiments along these lines we called co-operator experiments, where two people would interact with the device with a shared intention. And the results were very interesting. We found that when the two people were of opposite sex, they were getting results that were twice as large as either of them could get individually. When they were the same sex, the results were chance. But when the opposite sex pair were what we called a bonded couple, they were producing results that were 7 times larger than what, in other words, they had a resonance between the two of them that then brought the machine into that resonance. I think that was very important. I could go on to say, seeing, we also found gender differences, but that's for another day. But I think the idea that love turned out to be a stimulus to a human machine experiment was an important thing to add to my talk.
Well, interesting, because we've had in our, and I know you don't know our work, but we've had these really interesting anomalies happen that look at precognition, that look at psychic phenomenon, that look at coincidence, just happen over and over and over and over again. So one of the oddest, and the one that would just, we're in my sister's barn. So we're doing our little session and somebody comes up with their trance experience and says, this is the oddest thing, because usually we're all getting very ancient stuff. We're a very ancient, natural, earth-based landscape. And, you know, the Wizard of Oz came up. I don't know why. And we had to start laughing. And afterwards, the Wizard of Oz, what was it? She saw some element of the Wizard of Oz.
Of the Wizard of Oz in her experience, which is
So
kind of
I said,
an odd.
Yeah, where would this come from? You know, Wizard of Oz. So I said, well, we waited until all the experiences were done. And then I said, I have to take you over, put my computer on, I'm walking you over to the Wizard of Oz pinball machine that a friend of my sister's left over there on the other side of the room.
And the witch's slippers he purchased. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And then we'll do something where a future element will show up. A precognitive element. I mean, just
There's
odd
tons
and odd.
tons
We
of
record
data.
all these.
There's tons of data in this area
Yeah.
that we need to consolidate.
And I always thought
but yeah, it's
coincidences are like a pat on the back from the universe. Oh, you're going in the right direction here. As you sort through all the breadcrumbs of the forest and you're wondering which path to take, follow the coincidences that light up, bing, 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 and light your path. You know, it's...
Yeah. I've always thought that coincidences is the universe telling you that you're on the right path or you're in the right place at the right time. If I don't have coincidences happening, I worry. And when things are going well, I feel, you know, I keep getting these synchronicities, and I take that to mean that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So, I mean, they're a very important part of my life. They always have been, even before I met Bob, or before, like I said, it's back in the fairy tale days. I felt I couldn't talk to people or tell them about it because they think you're crazy, but I trust them.
Yeah.
I really do. That comes from the deepest source of all, as the man said.
I want to just for a moment honor the founder of this institute, because Dr. Felicitas Goodman, she had a similar path where she had to go and try to get the data, do the science, but also had that personal experience. She had that thing that she wanted to be able to validate, but she also wanted to do it in the proper way. And so there was that personal journey of having a foot in academia, but also wanting to explore this area of the unknown, this area of mysticism, and also someone who was a female in academia pushing the envelope, taking
even
a risk,
harder.
huge risk in the 1960s and 70s and beyond.
But to be daring and to go where the evidence leads you. I'd love to hear from Christine as well, since no other hands are raised at the moment. Just another female in an academic setting. Yeah. Christine, do you have anything to say? I guess we're putting you on the spot.
Oh, it's okay. I'm getting used to it. Hi, Brenda. This was a fabulous talk, and I love all your discussion on science and understanding statistics. I'm married to a statistician, but we often joke that there are statistics in there and there are damn statistics. So I had to laugh. This ongoing joke we have in our house. But this is wonderful. I have a very basic question because I'm by training an archaeologist. And when I think of remote sensing, I think of satellites in the air and us looking down and then having the scientists number crunch or doing GIS to do landscape or these type of things. I don't know if that's what you mean by your use of remote sensing. Could you clarify that for me, please?
Or Stephen Schwartz.
Well, it is what I mean, except without the satellite. Remote viewing or remote perception, as we called it, is an experiment where an individual that we might call the percipient, tries to access information about a geographical location where another person is, was, or will be situated at a given time. Okay. They have no sensory knowledge of what this target location is, and no way of accessing it. And they are picking this information up ahead of time before the target is even selected, or after the target has been visited.
Okay.
And
Yeah, that
what-
makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, and what we did at PEAR was we developed techniques to try to measure how much information is actually getting acquired as opposed to what you get by guessing.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes, that makes sense. And I would suggest with Cuyamonga, we do a lot of that and it works remarkably well. I'm sorry about my phone. Works just amazing. And I was talking to my husband, he's listening to this too, but there's something about Paul and Laura that I think that there's something psychic happening. They seem to kind of drive our trance states. And I know you've not done the practice, but there's a lot of curious things that happen with the Cuyamonga practice by Dr. Goodman. So I'm looking forward. I saw your list of all the books on your webpage, and I'm looking forward to, I don't know, wiping out my credit card and buying them and reading them. So I'm sure I will have lots of questions for you soon, but we'll talk more. I'm sure there are lots of other questions. And we just had one from Martha about definition of consciousness. And that's a great question. Something I'm grappling with my own work with mysticism. But what do you mean by consciousness? Thanks, Martha.
As I said earlier, my definition of consciousness is that it is the organizing principle of the universe. It is the yang that dances with the yin. Whether it's consciousness with a big C or consciousness with a little c, it is that which organizes our experience. This is why it creates Newtonian or quantum mechanics, but consciousness is how we organize and interpret the experiences we have in our interactions with our environment. It is what makes sense to us, and it might make sense, and it might change from one time to another, but it is that which organizes our reality into something meaningful.
Can I ask for another clarifying question? So I love that because in my anthro class, I talk about culture with a big C versus a little c. So culture are these overlying structures in a region. So the Northeast where you're at, or the Southwest, because the environments definitely change culture, big C there. But then you have individual cultures, which be like the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, or the Zuni Indians of the Southwest. So those would be little c. So is consciousness in this thing, the bigger universe is the big C, and then down at our brain level, a little c?
Yeah, just so. It's like being a facet of a huge gem. We are one little reflection of that gem, but we're part of it. And we're all part of it. Some of us like to think that we're gems all on our own. And
some of us are the cracks. I'm just kidding.
And that's how we've gone wrong in our relationship with nature and the planet.
Yeah.
We aren't separate and superior to the planet. We are a part of it. And, you know, I love the indigenous perspective on how we relate to nature. We've lost that, and we're destroying the world, and we're going to destroy ourselves if we don't return to that basic understanding.
What's interesting also about the work and that we're doing with Christine also is you look at an ancient artifact and somehow this activates it. What we're doing seems to activate it. And so this indigenous wisdom is speaking in the here and now across time. You talked about the flow of time. There's scientific theory that time can flow in two directions, and that in this field, the laws are different. Space-time is tilted differently. And we're finding that activating this ancient wisdom, and somehow it's speaking again. It's just extraordinary. I wonder if we can use remote viewing. I know Stephen Schwartz and others have done this. Look at a map and see where you can find some antiquities. But just as maybe the pilots of the future could be operating their machines through the mind, right? That's just as a nice sci-fi. I'm wondering if the archaeology of the future may somehow embrace work such as this and ask those artifacts to reveal a lot more.
in hidden layers. I don't know what the
I've
future.
often wondered what they were going to make of all of these little round shiny discs, and try to figure out, what the religious significance of them was. But I have to tell you, although I really had not heard of your institute and the work that you're doing until recently, since we've been in contact, but I used to do that myself. I actually have a collection of replicas, statues from different, ancient cultures. I'm a collector of all of these, and as a student of, old religions and so forth. And I have sometimes done that by putting myself in those positions as I've looked at them, and found that I sensed a connection. So, I'm with you all the way. I think we do have a connection, and I think we've lost contact with wonderful wisdom in our modern times with our deterministic paradigm. And we need to go back to that.
I liked your ionic bonding with the energy. So you have the two things. It can be us, the artifact, but there's an energy that's being pulled on. You did a very nice job with that example. And I love that, because that is kind of the sense I get when we're doing this practice, that there's something more, this energy that's really hard to explore or even test or trying to pull on it, but it seems to be real, or something's there.
Many years ago, I had a trip to the Natural History Museum in Philadelphia. I'm not sure it's the right name for it, but I remember I went into the Egyptian section, and they had these two life-size statues of Sekhmet in the hall facing each other. And when I walked past them, I felt an energy. And I did this a few times. I walked out and back, and I felt it each time. I ended up going to the gift shop before I left, and I bought two of the little replicas. The ones I have are only about this high, but they sit on facing each other in my living room. And I'm always aware of the fact I happen to be fond of Sekhmet. I like that aspect of the goddess, which is frequently ignored.
Her posture is one of in our canon, so we'll have to invite you to that session when we do that.
Well, I would like to learn more. I really admire what you're doing, and I'm finding this similarity or connection between your work and our work is wonderful.
Synchronicity.
Thank you. Thank you. Same here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank
And
you.
Victoria had a question. If
Oh,
we
yeah.
don't mind going a little over time.
Yeah, Victoria, you're the last question.
Yeah.
Hi. Oh my goodness, what a rich conversation. I'm so grateful for this and for all the connections that you're bringing up. And I was going to ask this one question, but then after Tony talked, I sort of evolved into another question. So my experiences of synchronicity have just been increasing to the point where they seem to be both guiding and validating all my conscious intentions. And not only that, but I am now aware that I'm reading a book on the quantum revelation by Levy. And he talks about quantum reality as very dreamlike. And what I've been noticing, in addition to what I just said, is that my dream life is becoming much more profound, and like the dreams are more collectively oriented. And after I wake from them, they continue into my lived life as a waking dream, bringing in aspects of the dream and having them continue in my world, and even in the worlds of other people that I am related with by bonding, by love. And these phenomena then are occurring in their lives. And I think that all of this is so important in terms of us understanding who we are as human beings. Yeah. And I know this quote by Václav Havel that says, unless we have a revolution of human consciousness, the catastrophe towards which we are headed is inevitable. He spoke those words to the US Congress if you can imagine that 30 some years ago to a standing ovation, which we wouldn't get in the US Congress as it is now. But his words were true. And I think this quantum understanding of consciousness is that which will fuel this revolution of human consciousness. And it is urgent. So I just, what about the dreamlike nature that quantum physicists have written about, of the dreamlike nature of consciousness? And how do we leverage all this to get a revolution of human consciousness?
I think we just have to be open to it and make it part of our reality. For me, it is the dominant part of my reality. I've also noticed, by the way, that whatever brings about coincidences and synchronicities tends to have a weird sense of humor.
Yeah.
And what's weird about it is it's the kind of sense of humor like my own.
Oh, interesting.
And
Spirit
that
speaks to us.
that is what
ways
is really strange.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you,
thank you for
Victoria.
summarizing, Victoria. I don't think we have time to wait for the new crop of budding scientists still in grade school to grow up and change things. I think it's incumbent upon all of us
Yeah.
to start now and to speak the
Thank you.
truth,
Yeah.
to speak for spirit, to speak for the planet, to speak for the universe, and to make it okay, to make it a conversation that is legitimate and valid and certainly needed, to stand up for the planet.
Yeah.
More and more people are experiencing synchronicity and able to label it as this. And I think it's not a hard thing to shift from recognizing that to realizing we're multidimensional people, that we're not just material inert things that, then die off, and, that there is this pervading consciousness that we're part of and participating with and playing with, that is related and bound by love. That love is an intelligence.
The
Well,
loving universe. Benevolent
One
universe.
of the most profound aspects of this understanding of consciousness and recognizing that we are more than just our own personal consciousness, that we're connected to something bigger.
Yeah.
The most important insight that one can get from that is that we don't have to be afraid of dying, because
Yeah.
it's just a transition. The consciousness goes back into the great consciousness, and there's who is this? VJ has a
VJ,
hand.
we're about to call him VJ.
I would like,
Yes.
Hello, VJ.
yes, I want to make a simple comment that consciousness is the order of function in everything. That's it. Simple way to understand.
Yeah.
Consciousness.
Hey, Indira. Yeah,
Hi.
you have something to add too, I know.
Well, I think I sent you that book, Gravity of Gravity,
Yes.
which touches many areas of what we are discussing. So I think we need a new theoretical framework where there are axioms.
Right.
And what are those 4 axioms is plenum, self-compressive force, consciousness as a order of function, and time. So one of our yoga teachers, he's no more, but we have been studying under him for more than 45 years. And I feel that science needs a new theoretical framework. Even Einstein, not so famous quote, he says it is theory which dictates what needs to be observed.
Right.
So if we have a new theoretical framework with the 4 axioms, it can be a breakthrough. And I think that we don't have to worry about Princeton or MIT or Planck or anything. We come as a group to propose this hypothesis based in these 4 axioms, which can be contributed by many, many people to arrive at what is consciousness, what is driving this whole universe. So once please, I want to hear Brenda comment on this.
I think that is a great insight. I have studied, or I don't know, studied, but tried to familiarize myself with many different religions and traditions. In particular, I think that we don't even need a new framework, because I think some of the old frameworks already are telling us what we need to know. I have to tell you that of the various statues and stuff that I mentioned, I have a large statue of the Nataraj, who has guided me through my life. He has shown up in various aspects of my experience when I needed it. And I have from time to time attempted to dance with him.
Yes.
But you know, what little I understand of his nature, I think answers all the questions that we have. We've just forgotten, or at least in India or in Hindu traditions, they haven't forgotten.
Right.
But we don't need to create a new one. Let's just try to remember what has already been taught by other cultures and traditions.
To revive the ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
It makes us arrive at the concept of Brahman, the pure space, absolute space, where everything originated.
Yes.
With that whirling wave and spreading wave,
Right.
creating the five elements, all life, and it's a very theoretical framework that if we understand, it is very, very easy to understand everything.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it. You know, the gods dance in that great Brahman, and in that dance, they are creating a reality. And each dance is a different reality. It's wonderful. I love it.
So they're saying in mythic terms what the leading edge of science is saying in its language, many languages saying the same thing.
Yes.
And we'll have a panel with you, Vijay and Dira, and some of your
all for it.
For consortium. And
Thank you.
Brenda, you have to come back with your consortium. And
Okay.
we need to dialogue this further because we're talking about key and source.
Yes.
Fundamental principles. We need to,
To
we need to
Brenda,
dance upon this pin of the
yes,
of the pin.
we will send the electronic version of that Gravity of Gravity. It's a small booklet to Tony, you, maybe everybody, and let's
We'll
have
make
a
it
dialogue.
available. And then we'll have that author come and talk. Thank you so much for that input. We appreciate, and thank you, Brenda. This has been such a delight, and you are so right that telling your stories really helps us to truly embrace and understand not just you, but all the work that you've done, all of the work that needs to be done, and the vision that is emerging. This is just an emerging story, as Brian started out to say, part of the Deep Time Network, the big history, the ICRL, this work. It's all coming together in such exciting ways. So the big rethink is underway, the big rethink underway.
It is. And I thank you for inviting me. There's one point I must make, and that is everything I was talking about today is not just me. It comes from the dynamic that I had with Bob. And that was the dynamic and the complementarity between science and spirit. And it was really in that combination that we were able to accomplish what we did. Neither one of us could have done that alone.
And so we want to honor Robert Jahn, and we have collected our archives, and we found our long ago interview with Robert, and so we'll be posting that, and many other scientists who, like yourself, dare to go where the science leads them. So we'll have an archive as in addition to our current crop of talks. So this is all we can do right now is talk about it and spin the web.
Well, we're creating a new community, and it gets bigger each time.
Yep. So
and when we come together in love and respect, we can do things that we can't do the other way.
Yep, indeed.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Well, thank you all.